Hi there, Allison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to the Niagara Peninsula in Ontario, Canada, and we're looking at the Southbrook Vineyards 2020 Saunders Family Vineyard Cabernet Franc. The story of Southbrook Vineyards begins in 1941 when Bill Redelmeier's grandfather purchased a dairy farm in Richmond Hill, Ontario, which later evolved into a thriving farm market in the 1980s, focused on sourcing the best and freshest local products from Ontario. Bill's longtime love of food and wine inspired him to start sourcing grapes from the Niagara Peninsula to make wine. And in 1991, Southbrook Winery produced their first 2,000 cases with the help of Derek Barnett, who has since gone on to become one of Ontario's most beloved and celebrated winemakers. Fast forward to 2005, and Bill is finally able to realize his dream when he purchased 74 acres of land in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area where he could establish his winery and develop its vineyards. In 2008, Southbrook became the first in Canada to achieve organic and biodynamic certification of their vineyards and winery, solidifying their position as an industry leader in green and sustainable initiatives. Still family owned today, Southbrook is farming around 60 acres of vines, and they're also working with a few select like-minded growers to source some grapes as well. They're working with the key varieties that excel in Ontario, namely Chardonnay and Riesling for the whites, and Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir, and Gamay for the reds, with a little bit of Merlot and Cab Sauv thrown in there as well. They're working with around 8 acres of Cabernet Franc vines to produce their wines, and these include a single-varietal Cabernet Franc rosé, as well as their entry-level Triomphe Cabernet Franc, and they're currently making 2 single vineyard Cabernet Francs, one from the Saunders Family Vineyard, which is on the Beamsville Bench, and the other from the Laundry Vineyard, which is in the Lincoln Lakeshore VQA subappellation. Since 2005, the Redelmeier family has been supported in the vineyard and cellar by one of Ontario's most renowned winemakers, Ann Sperling, who is their Director of Winemaking and Viticulture. And since 2019, Ottawa native Casey Hogan has been their winemaker. While the majority of Southbrook's vineyards are located in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area, and more specifically the 4 Mile Creek VQA subappellation, today we're looking at their Saunders Family Vineyard Cabernet Franc, and this is a vineyard that is located in the Beamsville Bench VQA subappellation. So that is going to be the focus of our terroir deep dive today. The Beamsville Bench appellation is one of 3 subappellations that make up the larger Niagara Escarpment regional VQA appellation, along with the 20 Mile Bench and the Short Hills Bench. The Niagara Escarpment is a key geographical feature that makes viticulture in the Niagara Peninsula possible, that along with the Lake Ontario to the north. This escarpment, this ridge, rises to a height of around 200 meters above sea level, and it helps to trap and circulate the airflow into the vineyards. And this airflow not only helps to reduce disease pressure and frost risk, but it also helps to bring in warm air from off the lake, which helps to raise the overall vineyard temperature. This helps to aid ripening, and it also helps to prolong the growing season. Now, this escarpment is layers of sedimentary rocks, predominantly dolostone, dolomitic limestone, sandstones, and shales that date to the Paleozoic era. How hard these rocks are, or how susceptible or resistant they are to erosion, has shaped the topography of the Niagara Escarpment area. Over the glacial events that happened over the last 2 million years, as these glaciers receded, these sedimentary rocks eroded away to form terraces or benches, which now make up the viticultural area of the Niagara Escarpment region. These wide north-facing terraces make up the larger Lake Iroquois Bench, which sits just above the historic shoreline of the ancient Lake Iroquois. These benches vary in width, degree of slope, elevation, depending on where you are. The Beamsville Bench is on the Bell Terrace. This is the first and the lowest of these terraces, and we have an elevation in this appellation of starting from around 115 meters above sea level, rising to around 170 meters above sea level, depending on where you are. The appellation as a whole stretches about 9.5 kilometers from east to west, and it varies in width depending on where you are, from as much as 2 kilometers from north to south, right in the center of the appellation, right around the village of Beamsville, to just a few hundred meters wide from north to south in the easternmost and westernmost parts of the appellation. In terms of microclimate, the Beamsville Bench is the furthest west of these appellations, of these benches. And generally speaking, as you move west along the Niagara Peninsula, you're getting into cooler conditions. However, the Beamsville Bench is actually the closest of these appellations to the lake, and that means that it has a stronger moderating influence from the lake. That means the growing season overall is actually a little bit cooler. However, it's actually a bit longer on both sides of the growing season. And that gives the Beamsville Bench a bit of an advantage in terms of growing degree days at around 1,588. And that is actually greater than the growing degree days of the 4 Mile Creek VQA subappellation in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area, which is widely regarded as one of the top sites or top sources for the Bordeaux varieties in the Niagara Peninsula. In terms of soils, across the Beamsville Bench, we're dealing with a mix of soils here, but we're dealing with predominantly a mix of red, yellow, and green olive colored clay loam tills with varying amounts of dolostone, shale, and sandstone fragments, depending on the vineyard and the parcel. The bedrock is, well below the surface, but we're dealing with layers of the whirlpool sandstone and the Power Glen shale and sandstone. Now, the Saunders Family Vineyard is in the western part of the Beamsville Bench. We are just less than 4 kilometers south of the shoreline of Lake Ontario. We're on a gentle north-facing slope at an average elevation of around 123 meters above sea level. There's 2 blocks of Cabernet Franc here, totaling around 1.2 acres. That's just under a half a hectare. And the north block was planted in 1999, and the south block was planted in the year 2000. And in terms of soils here, we're dealing with deeper soils that are a mix of red and green olive colored clay loam till with lacustrine and dolomitic limestone sediments throughout. This vineyard is farmed certified organic. They are employing regenerative farming practices as well. And Southbrook Vineyards has been working with the Saunders family to source grapes from their vineyards for their single vineyard wines since 2012. Now, from a winemaking perspective, in 2020, the yield off of these 2 blocks was around 1.5 tons per acre. The fruit was all hand harvested and it was entirely destemmed. Fermentation was in 1-ton bins with indigenous yeast, and the peak fermentation temperature hit about 30 degrees Celsius. The total time on skins was about 22 days, and they would have done some punch downs once or twice daily, just during the active fermentation time, the peak fermentation time. And then élevage took place in barriques. There was 5 barrels of this wine in total. 2 of those were new, and that was followed by blending and then minimal filtration prior to bottling. So let's dive into this wine. This wine screams Niagara Cabernet Franc to me. It just brings back a flood of memories every single time I taste Niagara Cabernet Franc. So the nose is really inviting. There's a nice purity to the nose. It leans a bit more fruit forward on the nose. The fruits come through as a bit more of like red fruit profile, but on the sweeter side, a bit of Bing cherry. There's a bit of red raspberry here. There's a touch of like a wild strawberry preserve note. Pyrazines are lovely, very classic, a bit of rosemary, some bay leaf. There's a little bit of a cured tobacco note as well, which is very Niagara Cabernet Franc. There's a nice florality to the nose, a touch of like purple flowers. There's a little bit of spice on the nose as well, but in general, the nose is quite inviting, very clean, very pure, very fresh. On the palate, those same sweeter fruits come through as they did on the nose. There's a little bit of a red currant note as well on the palate, but in general, the palate has some really nice ripeness to it. And I should note that the 2020 vintage was a fantastic vintage for red varieties, red Bordeaux varieties in particular in the Niagara Peninsula. It was a warmer vintage, so there's some nice ripeness here, which is really, really lovely. And then there's some additional layers here on the palate, which I'm really getting into. The pyrazines have a bit more of a cedar thing going on, which I really like. There's also more spice on the palate. It's actually quite spicy, which I like as well, and a bit more earthy on the palate too. So in terms of the spice profile, there's a bit of wood spice here, but there's also a bit of varietal spice. So I'm getting a bit of green peppercorn, but then there's some classic baking spices as well that you typically would expect from oak élevage, like clove, as well as a bit of allspice here. There's some other layers going on here too. A little bit of cocoa. There's a touch of graphite as well. The acidity is really mouth-watering, very fresh. You know, we do not have issues with acidity in the Niagara Peninsula, so the acidity is quite elevated, and it's providing some really nice tension in this wine. The tannins are firm. They're very fine in texture. The texture is reminiscent, I would say, of like a fine, high quality cotton. The overall profile of this wine, I would say, is medium bodied. There is a certain plushness to the wine. There's a certain roundness and breadth to the wine. You kind of get the sense that this is coming from a warmer vintage for the Niagara Peninsula, but it is by no means heavy or clunky. It's got some nice lift and energy to the wine overall. Yeah, it's delicious. It's super balanced. That acidity is nice and persistent. As I said, it's providing some nice tension, so it's providing that nice counterpoint to the slightly more dense and fleshy middle palate to this wine. I think the oak is a little bit more forward, but it is a young wine at this stage, and I do think that there is sufficient concentration here for that oak to integrate and for the oak tannins and the fruit tannins to integrate really nicely over time. You know, this is a great example of age-worthy Cabernet Franc from the Niagara Peninsula. And I've long been a fan of Southbrook's winemaking across the board. Their Cabernet Francs have always been consistently excellent. And this is a really exceptional example. And actually, this is my first experience with the Saunders Family Vineyard Cabernet Franc. I have a little bit more experience with the Laundry Vineyard Cabernet Franc. But this is my first introduction to the Saunders Family Vineyard Cabernet Franc. And this is a really, really delicious wine. And I'm so glad that I had a chance to get some of this, because this is already sold out, if you can believe it. They produced around 130 or so cases of this wine. Casey did tell me that they've held some back for re-release, but this was released, I think, in early September, and then shortly thereafter, this wine was written up in Decanter magazine. They did a huge report on Cabernet Francs from North and South America, and this was one of the top scoring Cabernet Francs of that report, and the number one wine from Canada that was rated. And while ratings are not the be-all and end-all, when you're a small, rather unknown wine region like the Niagara Peninsula is, and Canada is in general, those kinds of accolades are really awesome, because they affirm what we're doing here and the work that we're doing and the good work that we're doing here. And you know, Southbrook has always done great work with Cabernet Franc. This is a star variety in Ontario, and I really do intend to put a little bit more focus on some Ontario Cabernet Franc in terms of my coverage here going forward into 2024, which I know that might bug some folks in terms of my European readers and listeners and elsewhere, because these wines are a bit hard to find if you're not in Ontario. But hopefully it might inspire some folks to perhaps visit Ontario wine country and the Niagara Peninsula. But we are really doing amazing work with Cabernet Franc, and it deserves to be celebrated. So I intend to do that a little bit more going forward. If you were fortunate enough to snag a bottle of the Saunders Family Vineyard Cabernet Franc, let me know if you've tried it and what you thought of it in the comments below. Or if you have another favorite Cabernet Franc from the Niagara Peninsula, let me know what that wine is in the comments below. But otherwise, I will be back again soon, as I always say, with another wine. Cheers.